This is a production of Cornell University.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matt. And thank you all for coming out today. It's been a pleasure. It's been an awesome trip. I've been here since Monday, got to meet with a lot of you. It's been excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. And a special thanks to Natasha and Matt for hosting me. Like I said, it's been a wonderful trip. So I am going to share some research with you if my clicker works, but it doesn't need to. So I am based in the Twin Cities, and with the other 4 million residents of the Twin Cities metro area, we don't actually see farmland every day, but we do have an opportunity to see some of the impacts of our current farming system, even in our urban environment. So this is a photo that was taken about 3 miles from my house. I live back over here. And I'm sure hundreds of thousands of people go over the bridge every day that see this. And it's not coming through super clear, but this is actually the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Minnesota River. And if you can see, there is a huge amount of sedimentation coming in from the Minnesota River, phosphorus bound to some of those sediments, likely some dissolved nitrogen in there as well, and entering the Mississippi River, which goes to the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a major issue. So why is this occurring? Well, here's the cropland data layer of the landscape in Minnesota, just kind of the southern half of it. And here are those two rivers, roughly. This is the Minnesota River. Starts in the headwaters up in Itasca State Park. If you ever get a chance to go, it's absolutely gorgeous. Check it out. And here's the Minnesota River. And you can see that the Minnesota River is really surrounded by corn and soybeans. Totally dominated by corn and soybeans. That's the yellow and green pixels on this map. And the Mississippi largely flows through natural habitat from the north down to this confluence. So along the Minnesota River, we see a lot of images like this, especially in the spring. There is just no living cover on the landscape, or very little. And as a consequence, when we get a lot of our precipitation in the spring, we see major erosion events. And like I said, that erosion carries with it nutrients and this super valuable topsoil, causing some major environmental challenges, and others we can't see, like greenhouse gas emissions. So this kind of sets us up for the justification for doing this research. Currently our agricultural system is dominated by these annual monocultures. And they're critical, though, for supporting humanity. 50% of our global cropland is occupied by these 5 species. And if you look at these species, 2 of them are dominant cereal annual grains. And most of these, in a lot of parts of the world, are farmed with annual tillage, intensive use of pesticides and fertilizers, and other inputs, and largely as monocultures. So this is sort of the situation we have. We've created this agricultural system that's really productive, and but as a consequence, we've lost some of these ecosystem services that were once provided by our natural habitats, and we see some of these major challenges. So what we're working toward is developing new agricultural systems, those that are perennial and high diversity, with the goal of at least maintaining productivity, as well as providing some ecosystem services. And really, I want to push this system and see if we can actually exceed productivity from our current system, because we have our population is continuing to grow and getting richer, and the demand for food, fuel, and fiber is increasing. So as Matt said, I have the great pleasure of working in the Sustainable Cropping Systems Lab, and this is our goal. It's to diversify and perennialize cropping systems to improve productivity, economic viability, and then ecological integrity. We do that largely by focusing on perennial crops. There's a list of some of those that we work on here, as well as trying to enhance crop diversity. And that diversity can be enhanced through time in terms of diversifying crop rotations, or in space via intercropping, which I'm going to talk about today. And we focus a lot on agronomics. How can we develop these new systems that farmers can actually adopt and integrate into their practices? How can they be profitable? And at the same time, we measure those environmental impacts. So I'm just highlighted a few of the topics that we're going to cover in today's presentation, which is largely around intercropping. You'll see a lot about Kernza intermediate wheatgrass and alfalfa. I'm not going to cover too much of the environmental impacts. We'll just touch on the water quality, but mostly talk about agronomics and on how this system can actually be feasible. So why are we at all interested in intercropping? We already started alluding to this. It's a way to increase biodiversity on the farm. We can increase plant diversity within a field, which there's a lot of research that shows that that can lead to higher diversity levels of other taxonomic groups. Agronomic efficiencies, cover that soon, and also hopefully provide some environmental benefits. So in terms of these agronomic efficiencies, there's been a lot of research looking at how intercropping systems can increase water use efficiency. A couple of different mechanisms for this. Hydraulic lift, just complementarity of rooting systems, capturing more of the water that falls as precipitation, could lead to more yields. Intercropping can also help with pest suppression and disease suppression, physically altering the environment for pests to move. And a lot of these have been synthesized and I think in a great way presented in a paper out of Matt Ryan's lab in 2018. Check that out if you want to see a full description of those things. But then the other big agronomic efficiency that we're really interested here is the ability to provide nitrogen to our grain cropping systems through biological nitrogen fixation via legumes. And there's been a lot of work done on this. These are just some rough numbers from a few papers I was able to pull, and I have citations for this afterward if you're interested where they come from. But atmospheric N2 fixation by legumes, 13 to 17% of that has been observed to be transferred to the grains. Up to 35% of the nitrogen in a grain crop that's been intercropped has been found to come from BNF, biological nitrogen fixation. But the mechanisms are kind of tricky to track as well. So this nitrogen can come from the decomposition of the above ground plant tissues of legume tissues that can be decomposed and nitrogen can be made available for the cereal crop. Roots and actually the nodules themselves contain nitrogen that can be decomposed and made available to the grain crop. There are other, maybe more direct pathways, nitrogen transfer through mycorrhizal fungi, through root exudates. But all of this is designed to better synchronize the nitrogen supply and demand of these cropping systems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the potential might be enhanced with perennial crops. So what about yield? What do we know about the opportunity to increase productivity and yield using intercrops? There's a couple of ways to present this. And we can do these intercropping experiments with different designs. There's a replacement design and an additive design. So let's just take a look at an example of how we might calculate the yield benefit from an intercropping in a replacement design. Let's say we have our field of a monoculture of a grain crop like maize, yields 10 units per area. We have a soybean maybe that's yielding 4. Well, if we do a replacement design and do a substitution of one row for another, this is what we'd expect, right? With half the amount of corn plants in that field, half the amount of soybeans as the monocultures, combine them, this is our expected intercropping yield. But if there's any sort of facilitation, any transfer of that legume intercrop to the maize that benefits the yield, we would get this over-yielding effect. And this is one way we can measure it by calculating this thing called a land equivalent ratio. If we're really just focused on the outcome of the grain crop, we can focus on what we call relative yield. And this is quite a simple calculation. And now here we're looking at an additive design. So where we just have our monoculture, keeping the population the same and then adding a legume intercrop to that, not altering our grain yield population. What is the outcome? It's simply yield of the intercrop over yield of the monoculture. And you'll see this metric used throughout my presentation. So the key here is that if the value is over 1, we get a net benefit of the legume intercrop to the grain crop. If it's less than 1, it's a detrimental effect. And I might refer to this as if it's above 1, there's facilitation going on. If it's below 1, it's competition. There's a little bit more to that, but those will be some of the terms I use to describe these outcomes. There's a lot of examples of intercropping out there around the world. I'm just going to show you a snapshot, a couple of these. So there's sorghum pigeon pea intercropping systems that can be harvested for grain or for forage. This one you might have seen before here in New York, red clover underseeded into spring wheat. And folks are even intercropping corn and soybeans. It's one thing to manage this for forage, but quite a much more difficult thing to try to manage this for grain. As you can imagine, trying to harvest combine grain from corn out of a stand like this could be pretty tricky. So why don't we see these intercrops? If we know that they have potential to provide environmental benefits and boost productivity, why don't we see these a lot on the landscape? Well, there are a lot of different reasons, and there are some specific agronomic challenges. So the two different species might have very different needs in terms of preparing a seed bed or for establishment, the timing of seeding. They might require different fertility regimes. In a lot of cases, the pesticides are incompatible. But I'd argue that one of the reasons is that some of the nitrogen benefits take time. And with an annual cropping system, we don't have a whole lot of time. There's actually limited time for these ecological processes to play out. So this is just an example of a timeline of a corn and soybean system in the upper Midwest. Really, there's only about 4 or 5 months for all of those processes: production of the legume, death of the legume tissue, decomposition of the legume tissue, transfer to some inorganic source that it can be taken up by N. Those all can take time. Can it happen in 5 months in the upper Midwest? Maybe, but it might be more effective to give the system a little bit more time by working with perennials. We also have to think about balancing these populations of the two species. Really, we're trying to promote that facilitation and prevent the competition, and that can be tricky to do. So I think that by working with perennials, we have a potential to create intercropping systems that achieve these goals. And there are some perennial intercropping systems. We have alley cropping with fruits and nut trees. We have a lot of intercropping that's occurring in pastures and other forage systems. But until now, there really haven't been any intercropping systems that really fit nicely within a production row crop system and that provides human consumable grains, these cereal grains that are so important for humanity. Which leads me to intermediate wheatgrass, or Kernza. So intermediate wheatgrass is a cool season forage grass, perennial, introduced to the US in the early 20th century as a forage crop. And in the past 40 years, folks have been working to domesticate that and turn it into a grain crop, so breeding for larger seeds, higher seed yield. And it's proven to be rather successful in some ways because it's tolerant to a wide range of growing conditions, does require vernalization. And the trade name for the grain is Kernza. I'll try to refer to the plant as intermediate wheatgrass, and whenever I refer to the grain itself, I'll try to speak to Kernza, but a lot of times people use these terms interchangeably. So before I begin, I need to show you a timeline of a typical intermediate wheatgrass production system. Seeds are typically, not all the time, but usually sown in the fall, I'd say early summer or late summer, early fall. The plants produce some biomass, just vegetative biomass. Then they overwinter, providing some cover on the landscape that first year. The plants come out of dormancy very early in the year for the upper Midwest, mid-March sometimes, and begin vegetative growth. And they grow vegetatively for about 2 more months. And then stem elongation begins in about the second week of May in our region. That's when the seed head comes up. Flowering takes place in around the 4th of July. And then grain is ready to harvest late July, early August. And at that point, all the grain's removed, all the straw is typically harvested, and then the plant continues to grow just vegetatively for the rest of the season. And in Minnesota, that can actually be until early November. So now I want to just give you a quick overview of the nitrogen budget, give you an idea of how much plant tissue and how much nitrogen is in those tissues. in a typical intermediate wheatgrass stand. So these numbers are not meta-analysis averages. These are just ballpark figures based on many site years of data for Minnesota. So typically we can see about 800 kilograms of grain per hectare, which is about 20% of the grain yields we might see for spring wheat in Minnesota. So nowhere near our annual yields, but that's what we're looking at, and 3.4% nitrogen content. So in a field of Kernza, we might have about 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. The straw above ground biomass, about 4 metric tons, 1.1% nitrogen. We got 44 kilograms there. Roots, we see a lot of variability in root biomass. We've had measurements up to 9 metric tons per hectare down to a meter deep. So I'd just say on average here, another 4 metric tons, and then another 40 kilograms of N per hectare. So all in all, we're looking at a nitrogen need of about 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for this crop. So we have one of the first studies we did with intermediate wheatgrass, agronomic studies, was a simple nitrogen rate trial. Try to figure out how much nitrogen should be applied to maximize grain yields. We did this work at many sites and years and identified this optimum nitrogen rate of about 60 to 90 kilograms per hectare, which is less than what I just said the intermediate wheatgrass needs per year. And just so you know, the average corn fertilizer rate in Minnesota is almost 160. So we're talking about 50% of what would be applied to a corn crop. But it's kind of intriguing that this N rate is less than what we just showed you, what the plant is actually using in a given year. And what we've noticed is that when we apply more nitrogen fertilizer, we get lower grain yields because of this lodging. So the plant is prone to lodging. One of the reasons it's using that nitrogen to build taller stems and more leaves, and at the expense of grain production, and then those plants topple over and it's hard to harvest them, so we get a reduction in grain yield. But this is really important because we are very interested in identifying perennial crops to plant in these ecologically sensitive areas where nitrate leaching is a problem. So Minnesota has a big issue with nitrate leaching to drinking water. Most Minnesotans get their drinking water. Water comes out of their tap, comes from the groundwater, and we are seeing elevated levels of nitrate in that drinking water, mostly as a product of nitrogen fertilizers leaching into the aquifer. And this has major human health impacts. The concept's pretty simple. We have these annual row crops that require nitrogen in these aquifer headlands, wellhead protection areas, and we're applying anywhere between 140 and 160 pounds of N per acre, and in some areas of southwest Minnesota, it's more closer to 200. And lots of research has been done on looking at nitrogen use efficiency of corn. We know that only about 40% of that is recovered into the grain, and many studies have documented the amount of nitrogen that has actually escaped the corn systems into the aquifer. We're looking at losing 25 to 50 pounds per acre per year in corn. Again, this isn't one value from a meta-analysis. This is kind of a range from various studies. And so we've been doing this work with intermediate wheatgrass to understand its potential to prevent nitrate leaching. We know it requires less nitrogen for optimizing grain yields. We're not getting as much yield per acre, but less nitrogen is going in. Higher nitrogen use efficiency, and over again, we're seeing a lot less nitrate leaching to the groundwater because of this extensive deep rooting system. So lots of modeling exercises have taken place, done various field studies comparing Kernza or intermediate wheatgrass to corn, to soybeans, different fertilizer rates. We're seeing 2 orders of magnitude less nitrate leaching compared to our annual row crops. Okay, so where does this bring us though for intercropping? We are still interested in making that system more sustainable by providing nitrogen to the crop via biological nitrogen fixation. It would be really great to not have to fertilize these current systems at all. We'd also love to increase biodiversity and potentially increase total biomass. If we can add another legume to the stand, increase total biomass, and there's value to that biomass that we're going to talk about. Some of the challenges are, though, balancing that competition and facilitation, establishing our legumes and making sure that they persist, give the time required for those ecological processes to play out. And I'll talk a little bit more about whether or not this is a sustainable system. So I'm going to show you some results from just a couple of experiments first. This is one of the earlier studies, and we really wanted to screen what legumes could work. So we tested these 6 different legume species with intermediate wheatgrass. Then we also had intermediate wheatgrass monocultures, controls with no fertilizer, and then we fertilized some plots with either 45 or 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. I am not going to go through all the different traits of these legume species, but just to kind of lump them together, we tested these 2 very common legume forages, alfalfa and red clover. They have differences in their root architectures, their persistence, their yield. So we wanted to see if any of those might influence the competition facilitation trade-off. We tested a few other not so common legumes, but they also have different traits. White clover, very low-lying. Alside clover and bird's-foot trefoil. And the last one we tested is actually native to the tall grass prairie in the Midwest. That's Canada milkvetch. So we're just curious, could we potentially integrate this native perennial legume with intermediate wheatgrass? All right, so on to the data. This is the first figure. You'll see a few of these. We're looking at the relative yield. And I said anything above 1 is a net facilitation. There's more biomass being produced by the intermediate wheatgrass in the intercrop compared to no intercrop, compared to the monoculture. And with this figure, we're looking at total intermediate wheatgrass biomass. So the vegetative biomass and the grain combined. And this is the first year. We did this study at 3 sites. I'm only going to show you data from 1 site because it varied a lot across sites. And they'll just show you even the variability within 1 site. So we saw a net increase in biomass as a response to some of these legume species, which was nice to see some facilitation occurring in that first year. Look at the red clover, which is a pretty common forage legume. We actually saw some competition occurring there, less intermediate wheatgrass biomass. Alfalfa, we saw some net facilitation. But again, this is overall biomass. So one could imagine that in an environment with another species and more competition, turns intermediate wheatgrass might tend to grow taller as there's more competition for light. And so maybe just that increase in biomass is only coming from the vegetation. What we really want is an increase in grain yield. So this is the first year. And just to show you a snapshot of what happened in the second and third year, we got a lot of variability. There's no standout legume here that consistently resulted in over yielding in terms of total biomass. But let's look at the grain. So here's the grain relative to 0N, and this is what we're really interested in. Are any of these legumes really increasing grain yield when we intercrop them? And we are seeing some. Alfalfa, red clover here did really well by the 3rd year, Alside clover. But again, there's no real consistent pattern. And then when you look at the other sites, again, there's just no standout legume species. So there's a lot of things occurring here, and we got to start to tease some of these things apart. So you also might wonder, well, are there actually legumes in those plots where the grain yields are better or worse? Like, is there really a relationship between the legume and the intermediate wheatgrass? One way to look at that is simply by plotting legume biomass yield against the relative grain yield. So as there's more legume biomass in a plot, we're seeing less grain yield. That makes some sense. The more plants you have in there, the more competition there's going to be. But what we're really interested in looking for is if there's any points in this area where we can get some legume biomass in the plot, but still have an increase in grain yield relative to the monocultures. So we're looking for if there's any area up in here. And we see some points. And so we can start to investigate, why did those plots have over yielding? Was it the species? What was the population? Things like that. And we're been thinking that these legumes are going to benefit the intermediate wheatgrass via nitrogen fixation and transfer. And that's tough to quantify. And Evelyn Riley is the graduate student on this project. Worked with Dr. Jess Gutknecht, who's at the University of Minnesota. She's a soil ecologist, and they did this work tracking nitrogen transfer using natural abundance of nitrogen isotopes. And any asterisk here indicates a situation where there was a statistically difference in nitrogen transfer from 0. So here, none of these are statistically significant. We didn't actually see a transfer until the 3rd year at this site, and only with 3 of these species. And if we look further into this potential leg, we can see that year 1 legume biomass is actually correlated with the year 3 relative grain yield. So plots that had a lot of legume biomass in the first year, it appeared that there was actually some competition in year 1, but that biomass later translated to potentially being beneficial for grain yields in years 2 and actually year 3 when we picked it up that it was because of the nitrogen transfer. Now, again, there's a lot of other mechanisms as to why the legume intercrops might influence grain yields. We talked about pest suppression. There's a lot of water dynamics happening with these systems. So we're just kind of getting at the tip of the iceberg with this. Another question we have is, can a producer do something in the field to manage these populations or to alter this interaction between the species? So we tried answering this question through an OREI project that was led by initially Steve Coleman and now Leo Dice at Ohio State. Matt Ryan and Tim Cruz are also hosting this experiment. And we're looking at 2 different legume species, alfalfa and red clover, also comparing the results to fertilized intermediate wheatgrass with organic manure. And what we're really testing here is different procedures for establishing the legumes. So let me explain a little bit more about that. Everything I've showed you so far, we have established the intermediate wheatgrass and the alfalfa at the same time in the fall. And I've showed you these configurations where we have rows, sown rows of the 2 species. So we did that in this study. We have our intermediate wheatgrass monoculture, no fertilizer, sow it in the rows. And then one set of treatments, we introduced our legume with the intermediate wheatgrass within the same row. So we mix the seed. And we have our alfalfa and our red clover established in the fall. And we have another set of plots where we sowed the intermediate wheatgrass into rows in the fall, and then frost seeded our legumes, broadcast that seed over the top. So we gave the intermediate wheatgrass a little bit of a head start before sowing or planting our legumes. And then the third configuration is this really delayed legume seeding. We actually let the intermediate wheatgrass go through a full life cycle. We harvested grain, really gave it a head start, and then we planted our legumes in the summer. We broadcast seeded in between those harvested rows. And we also have monocultures that we applied manure onto at different rates, and we applied that manure in the spring, important to know, 3 different rates from 56 kilograms per hectare to 224. All right, so that's just a list of the treatments. We're going to look right away at the relative grain yield, and this is relative to the unfertilized monocultures. And we can only look at the 2 establishment systems, the fall sowing and the frost seeding, because the summer wasn't seeded yet in the first year. We saw some over yielding with that red clover, just kind of opposite of what we saw in the first study. By year 2, there's not much of a difference in terms of yield, and by 3, we had a lot of variability. So here might be a good time to start looking at the actual population of the legume in the plots. Some of these are not very persistent, like red clover. So let me back up. So this is relative to the unfertilized monocultures. Now we could take a look at these plots and ask, well, what's the nitrogen equivalency of that over yielding? So we could potentially compare yields of these intercrops to fertilized monocultures, which is what we do here. So all the points go down as you'd expect, because the monoculture fertilized yields are a little bit higher. But we can still see that we're getting close to that That's at 1x, so that's 112 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So that can be a one way to quantify that benefit of the intercropping in that system. Same plot as before. I showed you legume biomass correlated with the relative grain yield to the unfertilized. Seeing the same thing. We're seeing, as expected, a reduction in the relative yield as you get on the high end of these legume populations, but we're looking for these spots, right, where we can get a balance of high grain yields and legume intercrop biomass. Now, for the first time, I'm just going to show you actual yields, because we also have to think about this from a farmer's perspective. Relative yield is great and all, but what's the actual economic viability of these systems? So this is grain yield in kilograms per hectare. I said around 800 is kind of this ballpark figure that we see a lot of times from our trials in Minnesota. So we have our alfalfa intercrops, our red clover intercrops, and then the control and 3 nitrogen rates. Year 1, pretty similar yields for some of these intercrops compared to the fertilized rates. We see this nice classic curve of increasing nitrogen fertilizer rate. You get more yield. And we're seeing yields exceeding those of the intercrops in year 2. And then we see this classic also decline in grain yield by the 3rd year. And this is ubiquitous in a lot of our experiments. But for some reason, that high-end plot was the yield crash wasn't as great, which is an interesting point in its own. And then here's the same figure, but with total forage yield. And now I'm calling it forage yield because we are thinking about using this biomass. So this is the mix of the alfalfa and the intermediate wheatgrass biomass. And we should really be thinking about this in terms of economic value. That legume material has a higher nitrogen content, has more crude protein, has more nutritive value, and actually has more economic value. So as I mentioned, this is a dual use system. We're looking at harvesting the forage at different times. Going back to our timeline of intermediate wheatgrass, we can harvest the forage in late April, early May, as long as we do it before stem elongation. Otherwise, we take off the seed heads and there won't be any grain that year. Producers can harvest that forage or graze the field. There's also quite a bit of value to the straw. And I'm calling it straw, but it is higher nutritive value than like wheat straw. It's greener, there's more nutrients there. And then the plant, as I mentioned, continues to regrow only vegetatively in the fall. And there's another opportunity there to either mechanically harvest or graze that material. So if you count it, there's actually 4 opportunities of revenue for a producer: spring graze, summer grain, straw forage, and then a fall forage. So it's important to actually quantify these, which is what Mitch Hunter did as a postdoc a few years back. And this is just forage yield and quality at the different utilization periods. So spring forage, summer straw, fall forage. So in a nutshell, there's not much there in the spring, but it's excellent quality, really high quality. Straw in the summer, there's a lot of it there, but it's pretty meager in terms of quality. Fall right in the middle. So it's useful to actually quantify this. And we did this in a study where we actually grazed stands of intermediate wheatgrass that was managed as a monoculture with fertilizer or with legume intercrops. So replicated complete block design. You can't really see this very well, but there you can see the paddocks in this picture. And so these are the values after a 3-year production period. So we have our intercropping system and then our monoculture. The intercropping, we actually had to put down about 50 units of N in one of the years because it was looking quite nitrogen depleted. The other system, it was over those 3 years, it was 450 kilograms of nitrogen were applied. This is the total amount of biomass removed from both systems. We had a little bit more from the legume intercrop, as we might expect. We actually measured the amount of nitrogen harvested because we looked at the nitrogen content of both the intermediate wheatgrass and the forage legume. And then we can see what the soil N available nitrogen was after the study, and substantially lower. This is a really dynamic number, but we did see significantly lower available N in the intercrop. Relative yields from this system. So the green points is relative total forage yield. So higher yields with the intercrop compared to the monoculture, but grain declined with stand age. So in the first year, there wasn't much of a difference between intercrop and monoculture, but the monoculture yielded more grain in year 2 and 3. So how do we value this addition of the legume to the system in terms of the forage? And what is the economic cost of that reduction in grain yield by adding the legume? We did a simple enterprise budget here, and I'm not going to walk through all the numbers, but some important assumptions are the value of the grain. We valued that at $2.50 per kilogram. Value of the unit of crude protein, $1.22. Cost of urea was pulled from what we paid for it. And when we come down the net return, this isn't really a net return because we didn't quantify the cost of the harvest, but just to apples here, a little bit more of a potential return from the legume intercrop. So to summarize that, anything that's above the line, there's more of in the intercrop, below is more of in the monoculture. A lot more fertilizer was applied to the monoculture. We had more grain in the monoculture, but we had more forage, and more protein was harvested in terms of potential benefit for the dairy system, and a slight increase in revenue potential from the intercropping. So this all needs a lot of work and much more replication, but it's I think a starting point for starting to assess this. But in summary, we've noticed that the biological nitrogen fixation from those legumes might not be enough to make up for all that nitrogen we're removing with the forage. Nitrogen depletion is probably one of the reasons why we saw that grain yield decline with stand age in the intercrop, because it just wasn't getting enough N. And the value of the increased protein from legumes seems to be able to offset that grain decline right now. But again, it's going to depend on the price of the grain and the forage. So I wish I had a whole nother seminar to talk about the environmental impacts of this system, but I don't have much time left here. So just going to give you a snapshot. Do legume intercrops affect, these environmental issues that we're concerned with? Just talk about water quality. We measure water quality by using lysimeters, so we can sample soil water beneath the rooting zone, and then we look at how much nitrate is in that soil water. And we did this in monocultures with and without fertilizer. And then we did this with an alfalfa intercrop. But all of those intercrops did have 40 kilos of N applied to them. So it was the legume intercrop plus fertilizer. Just show you some results. So in the first year, this is the concentration of that nitrate in the soil water. 10 parts per million is sort of the magic number. EPA set that as the safe drinking limit. And so you can kind of think about that number there. We saw some elevated nitrate levels in the soil water beneath the intercrop with fertilizer compared to the no fertilizer control, but it was a lot less than our fertilized intermediate wheatgrass. To give you some sense of what this is relative to annual row crops, in our corn system, we often see the value between 25 and 60. So we're still substantially lower than what we'd see in an annual. But then we saw that decline with stand age, and actually by the third year, there was less nitrate in the soil water even compared to the unfertilized monoculture. So there's potential there to mitigate nitrate leaching while using these intercrops. So thinking forward, what's the future research on this? Well, working with Ginny Moore and others here to figure out if we can breed legumes for intercropping, specifically in this case, alfalfa. There's a lot of different alfalfa cultivars out there with a lot of different traits. So we want to start to understand what traits are important. We're looking at alfalfa with different fall dormancy values, different kind of phenotypes. We're also combining this with different N rates, and Megan's going to be summarizing some of this research. You'll probably hear from her pretty soon. On the other end of the spectrum, we're also looking at, can we breed intermediate wheatgrass to be a better partner in an intercropping system? What are the right traits of the grass to help promote that facilitation and balance that competition? So we're working with the kerns of breeders, and we have different lines with different traits, and we're intercropping those with 2 different species, alfalfa and red clover. and also varying the configuration just a little bit. Last thing we're kind of interested in is looking at mixtures of legumes. And this research is actually done. We should be writing this up pretty quick, but we did test different mixtures. And these mixtures were actually handpicked from farmers in the different states based on what they're interested in and used to working with. So it was really a farmer-informed study, and we're really excited to be analyzing that soon. So I just want to acknowledge a whole bunch of people who've contributed to this work. These are past postdocs and graduate students who've graduated since I joined the Sustainable Cropping Systems Lab in like 2017. Current postdocs, I really want to highlight research staff. These are really hard experiments to do and very complex, and they do such an amazing job at making these things work. It just blows my mind every day. So mad props to the research staff and then current students who are working on this. Also, all the summer undergraduate interns who sweat a lot and fight off insects during the summer to collect this valuable data. Want to acknowledge teammates at the University of Minnesota, and then definitely what I call perennial crop pioneers. These are farmers who I've had the pleasure of working with. A lot of these folks have hosted on-farm trials and meet with to inform our research goals and priorities. They've taken a big risk in not just working with us, but also trying to advance this perennial crop vision. And thanks to the funders, and that's all I got. So I think I can take some questions.
You have plenty of time for questions here. Jake, do you want to call people out?
Yeah, just checking the Zoom chat. There's none there yet, so.
Yeah, this was a really cool talk. One of the things I was curious about when you were talking about the 3-year study and you were talking about nitrogen in your grain yield and how that corresponds to protein, did you ever measure the protein in the grain specifically compared with the monoculture as opposed to just total nitrogen in the biomass?
I don't think we have, and that would be a good thing to do. The protein, so because it's really interesting, Kernza does have higher protein levels per unit of grain than wheat. So that's one of the selling points of Kernza, high protein grain. So that should be looked at. I don't think we analyzed that. That's a good point. Thanks for that. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, you said the nitrogen fixed by legume may not compensate nitrogen removed.
Yeah.
I think those measures you are thinking about biomass. How about soil nitrogen?
How about soil nitrogen? As in, what was the contribution of that to the nitrogen that was removed?
If you include soil nitrogen, will that affect your conclusion? Yeah,
well, I think I didn't show this, but we did see a depletion in soil nitrogen through time. So it appears that the intermediate wheatgrass was using nitrogen that was being mineralized from organic matter through time, because we saw that, and now this spurred some new experiments. So we're actually now quantifying nitrogen mineralization rates in intercropped versus monoculture systems. So that is sort of an unanswered question that we're trying to get at right now by collecting some new data. Yeah, hopefully that can help us understand these outcomes a little bit more. Yeah.
Thanks for that excellent presentation, Jake. What do you think, why do you think Kernza is so variable in its responses to things like red clover and just management? I mean, you pointed this out in your presentation, different studies having different results, and that can also be found for things like mowing or cultivation. Like at some sites, certain practices help Kernza and others it doesn't. What makes Kernza so
variable? It's an open pollinated species for one thing, and I think the genetics are part of it. There's a lot of variability. So this isn't like wheat where you look out of the field and it all looks homogeneous and the same. You have plants that are different sizes in terms of stature and different number of seed heads per plant, and there's just a lot of genetic variability out there and a lot of just variability in the phenotypes as well, and even a given field. So I think that's one reason. Another is that not all of these studies have been conducted with the exact same agronomics, like seeding rate, row spacing, time of seeding. So when we compare some of those legume intercropping studies from other institutions and things, we kind of have to be aware of what differences there were for just our basic agronomics. baseline soil nitrogen levels. It's just a lot of things that could confound the treatments in these studies. There's recently been one meta-analysis that just came out from some collaborators of mine at the University of Minnesota, trying to account for those differences in all the studies that were conducted in Minnesota. So I can point you to that paper if you want to dig into the weeds a little bit. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so maybe a bigger picture question. So intermediate wheatgrass is a crop. I guess I'm curious, as someone on the forefront, where do you see intermediate wheatgrass going, let's say 25 years? Like, where do you think it will go, or where would you like to see?
Okay, yeah, great question. I think for the next 5 to 10 years from now, I think growers should be thinking of it as a 3-year crop that would fit into a rotation, potentially following an alfalfa stand, preferably in a situation where they can use the forage. That's going to be an economic safety net because the grain market is quite volatile right now. So in the near term, that's kind of where I see it. Producers who can use the forage and are comfortable marketing their grain or working to market their grain a little bit. And there's probably going to be a premium too for organic, regenerative organic specifically. Longer term, so the plant breeders are thinking that if we stick on the trajectory that we're at now for increasing seed size, I think Prabin said 23 years we'll have kernels that are the same size as spring wheat in Minnesota. But now as the breeding program continues, diversity is going to decrease, so that rate might not increase. But if we could hold that rate steady, 23 years. So I could see it becoming less of a niche crop and more of a mainstream crop if we can achieve those yields. Okay.
Just wondering if you have an idea how much of it's due variation for the weather from year to year. Then there's the interaction of the weather with the age of the intermediate wheatgrass.
Yes.
You would think it would be useful to know what was the approach we use in our long-term experiments today was what kind of the intertwines that are stagnant. So
yes.
You always have like first year intercrops present and second and third year.
Yep. Yeah, I'm super happy you brought that up. I do think weather is a really important confounding variable that's making it difficult to understand how yields are changing with stand age. We have some evidence that suggests that too. But in terms of the staggered start, that's exactly where we're heading. And we've initiated 2 experiments with a staggered start design. And what this means is we start the experiment in 1 year in a randomized plot design, and then the second year we plant the exact same treatments again. Third year, plant the exact same treatments. That way, we can tease apart stand age from year of growth. So we just initiated this, and we're planting the 3rd year. We're starting our 3rd year of a study. It's pretty much a nitrogen rate trial, a staggered start, and we're quantifying the fate of the nitrogen more comprehensively in this study, and we're hiring a postdoc. So I'm really happy you reminded me of that. I brought the announcement, and I'll send it to Matt and others, and if that can be distributed, that would be great. That job is open, and it's an exciting time to join the team because there's some data there. We got a couple more years of the project to go, so excited about it.
During the trials, do you ever have any extreme weather events? So would it drought affect?
Yeah. We've had unusually low precipitation values for probably 2 or 3 out of the years that I showed you. The data I showed you spanned from probably 2017 to 2023. And I think there were 2 or 3 years where there was like a statistical drought. And that's, tricky because not all of these experiments have our staggered start. And it's one of the motivations for doing that. So can the effect of that drought be teased apart with statistics? I think in some cases it can. And in a lot of the situations here, we've just tried to analyze the data based on the measure the response variables, from comparing across treatments. And then step 2 is to really dive in a little bit more and try to see if we can tease apart these year-to-year things.
Yeah, thinking along the lines of ecosystem services.
Yep.
At some point, did you ever measure soil health or organic matter dynamics in these two systems?
Mhm.
And thinking also from the question, maybe with carbon credits
Yeah,
becoming a thing
yeah.
in the next 20 years, could that be a potential that perennial cropping system could tap into?
The folks who are going to make products with Kernza and sell those are really hoping that we measure that data soon because they want to market those environmental benefits, specifically those related to soil health and carbon. And we have been measuring some of those variables. Jess Gutnick, my collaborator at the U, leads a lot of that work. And some of those studies are really close to being published. Actually, one was published by Manbir Rakhar, Egg Ecosystems and Environment, 2023. And she looks at enzyme activities, microbial biomass, PLFAs, all that sort of stuff in response to Kernza and annual crops. There's one question on the Zoom. Can I take that one quick? We have enough time?
Sure.
It's Sandra.
If you have to leave it, certainly.
Yeah, feel free to step out if you have to. As far as forthcoming breeding work with Kernza, which traits will be focused on as a priority? Grain size, kernel size is number 1. Grain yield is what we want to maximize. But a couple important traits include threshability. So the grain retains its hull right now for the most part. We want to have free threshing grain. And then we also want to reduce shattering. So it's still sort of a wild plant. And if a farmer waits too long, seed falls off, loses yield. And we actually have recruitment in the field, and that causes some problems. So those are the main traits we're focusing on.
All right, let's take a round of applause.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.